I thank the Speaker. This week in Congress, we have considered in the House Financial Services Committee legislation that will increase and expand the sanctions against the government and the dictators in North Korea. Mr. Speaker, the North Asian region and our allies there is of critical importance to the United States economically. South Korea and Japan are major economic partners to the United States. Both countries represent a major partnership in our security interest in North Asia. And so it is fitting that we continue to work in Congress along with the Trump administration to increase the financial sanctions and economic sanctions on the rogue government in North Korea. For our citizens, it's important to trace back the history of U.S. sanctions and the relationship with North Korea. Going back 4 presidents, Trump, Obama, Bush 43, and Clinton, we have been dealing with North Korea. President Clinton agreed to a, quote, freeze and dismantlement of the North Korean nuclear program, Mr. Speaker, and as a result, the North Koreans agreed to inspections, and the United States, along with allies, agreed to $4 billion in payments to the regime. That was in 1994, Mr. Speaker. We don't have much to show for that effort. In January, in the State of the Union, 2002, President Bush, 43, described North Korea as part of the axis of evil, including Iraq and Iran. Clearly, the North Koreans were not complying with Mr. Clinton's agreement, but the post-9/11 world of the United States had our government, our diplomacy, our military, our sanctions regime focused on the Middle East, focused on Afghanistan, Iraq, and indeed, Iran. And then you come to the period of President Obama, where his strategy with North Korea was one of strategic patience. And we've had 8 years, Mr. Speaker, of strategic patience. And what have we got to show for that? Unprecedented numbers of ballistic missile flights, unprecedented numbers of nuclear tests. So, Mr. Speaker, after over 2 decades, it was time for a change. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to take the floor of the House today and thank the leadership of President Trump and his very capable national security team led by Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, for ending strategic patience and for taking our country and the world in a different direction to end the nuclear ambitions of North Korea. Now, the United States, on a bipartisan basis in this House and in the upper chamber in the Senate, along with the Trump administration, are fully on board with using all the tools that we have to once and for all lead to denuclearization of the peninsula and end North Korea's rogue program to join the group of nuclear nations. They've taken themselves out of nuclear non-proliferation. They are a rogue nation. And I'm very pleased to see Secretary Mnuchin at the Treasury focus on what new financial sanctions under current law the United States can pursue by our Treasury Department. I'm very pleased with Chairman Royce of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ranking Member Ingalls, and the Financial Services Committee on collaboration on legislation on how we enhance sanctions that the United States can place on people doing business with North Korea and North Korea itself. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Haley, for not one but two 15-0 votes in the UN Security Council on ratcheting up the pressure on sanctions. Those are important. But the most important thing is, Mr. Speaker, whether it's secondary sanctions and sanctions in the United States put on others by the U.S. alone, or multilateral sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council, the secret is enforcement. We must have enforcement. And when you look back over this 2-decade period, you can't really come to the conclusion that we've ever seriously sanctioned the rogue government in North Korea. Not to the extent that we've done with Iran, not to the extent that we did with Iraq, the two other partners in President Bush's axis of evil. So the time is now, Mr. Speaker, to use all of our skills and abilities diplomatically, as led by Secretary Tillerson, economically, as led by Secretary Mnuchin, and our worthy, great leader, our ambassador at the United Nations, and in military strategy with our allies under Secretary Mattis. We have the support of the world now, Mr. Speaker, and this is no time to not bear down and get that kind of enforcement. I was so delighted on behalf of the Congress and on behalf of the United States that just yesterday, Prime Minister Modi in India and Prime Minister Abe on a visit to India reiterated their strong support for enforcement of the United Nations sanctions. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank this administration for taking a new look and taking North Korea's ambitions seriously and taking the issue of using all of our absolute capabilities, whether they're diplomatic, economic, or military, to end this rogue nation's nuclear ambitions.